Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Daniel 8 and his vision of the insolent king. Already, we've seen in our book of Daniel that it's divided into two major sections. Chapters 1 through 7 give us 7 historical narratives. It's written in the third person. Now comes the change. We're going to see Daniel writing in the first person. It's going to be, he'll be saying, I, Daniel, am writing this. I, Daniel, had this experience. And this will give us 4 prophetic visions. We had that first section. Most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, including the first part of Daniel chapter from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 2 and verse 3. And then we have a section written in Aramaic, and now we're back to Hebrew. So for those who read Hebrew, we're back to comfortable ground. We had a prologue in chapter 1, prophetic history relating to the Gentiles in chapters 2 through 7. Now we're going to see some of that same history, but the focus now will be that history as it relates more to the Jewish people. We start off chapter 8 and verse 1 in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king. Remember, Belshazzar had met his end back in chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, he had been killed. But we see now another vision. This isn't a vision that Belshazzar is. It's a vision that Daniel has. It appeared to me, Daniel. Notice Daniel's the one speaking. Subsequent, that is, after the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa. Susa is one of the palaces, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. They actually had a winter capital and a summer capital. It's a seasonal. Babylon had been the capital of the Babylonian Empire, but now the Persians are ruling, and so notice that Daniel's no longer in Babylon. Now he is in Susa, which is in the province of Elam. Elam had actually been the name of the country, but now it was no longer a country. Now it's just a province, a part of the Persian Empire. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. We're going to see in just a moment. Daniel's going to tell us. We won't have to guess. He's going to tell us that this ram represents the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Notice there's 2 horns. So you have the Medes, which is the mountain people to the north, and then the entire empire belonged to Persia. But technically, the land of Persia was a bit more to the east off our map, but the entire empire now belonged to Persia. So 2 horns. The shorter one would have represented the Medes. The longer one, that's the ruling family, would have represented the Persians. Now, we've already seen, by way of review, in chapters 2 and chapter 7. Chapter 2, we had a vision of a great statue, and in chapter 7, we had a vision of beasts rising up from the sea. And both of these visions, both the statue and the beasts, represented a succession of kings and kingdoms. So that chapter 2, you had the head of fine gold, and it represented Babylon, pictured in Daniel 7 as a lion with wings. Then in chapter 2, you had the statue going from the head on down, the breasts and arms of silver, representing the Medes and the Persians. Notice the twofold breasts and silver. And in Daniel 7, that's pictured as a bear with 3 ribs in its teeth. The 3 ribs either portraying 3 of its mightiest kings, or perhaps the 3 different portions of the world that it had conquered in order to come into power. In Daniel chapter 2, you had moving down to its belly and thighs were made of bronze. And this, we suggested, represents the Greek Empire. In Daniel 7, is pictured as a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. Leopard is, remember, a very fast animal representing the conquest of Alexander the Great, how he took the rule of Macedon and within 10 years conquered the entire Persian Empire. But then once he divided, it was divided up into 4 heads, looking at perhaps his 4 leading, I don't know about if they were the leading generals, they were the big winners once the dust settled. All the generals fought among each other, but these 4 eventually retained their power for many years, over 100 years. Next, in Daniel 2, you have the legs of iron and clay, and then 10 toes sort of circled in your mind's eye, that number 10. And we put a question mark. Does this refer to Antiochus the fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, or does this refer to something in the days of Rome? Some people even want to make it sometime in the future. I don't think we have to do that. And then Daniel 7, notice the 10 again. It's a beast with iron teeth, but then there's 10 horns. So 10 toes, 10 horns. We come to the end of each vision. In Daniel 2, it ends where all previous kingdoms are destroyed by a stone cut without hands. In Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days takes his seat and passes judgment. And in both cases, that's the coming of the Lord and his kingdom. And in Daniel 2, we read of a new kingdom that will never be destroyed. In Daniel 7, his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. So from beginning to end, these two visions, these two parallel visions, and I say parallel, even though one's in chapter 2, one's in chapter 7, there's a format to the entire section. It's chiastic, and so these two sections are in parallel. Now, I go over this because as we come to Daniel chapter 8, we're going to see a portion of this repeated. But first, I need to tell you a bit about this person, Antiochus Epiphanes. We've given a little bit in a previous class. We're going to give quite a bit more when we get to Daniel chapter 11. Antiochus was a Seleucid king. He was one of those four kings. Seleucus was the Greek general who grabbed Mesopotamia and Anatolia and lands to the east all the way to India. Eventually, he gave up some of those in return for war elephants. And he tried to force the Jews to worship the Greek gods. Now, how that came about, we're going to give all the details in Daniel chapter 11. But he tries to Hellenize. The word Hellenize just means that he wants to get them to adopt Greek culture, Greek language, Greek culture, Greek worship. And he tries to get them to leave their God and worship the Greek gods. He figures that will make them more pliable. And so to do this, he goes into the temple of God in Jerusalem, and he sets up a pagan statue of Zeus. People weren't sure what Zeus looked like, so they made it look like Antiochus, at least in the minds of the Jewish people. This abomination which rendered the temple desolate. We're actually going to see those words used both here and especially in Daniel chapter 11. And the Jews revolted, what we call the Maccabean revolt. They revolt against this pagan worship, and little tiny Judah fights against this giant kingdom, this almost an empire, I want to call it, of Antiochus Epiphanes. And they, to everyone's surprise, they gain their independence. That independence is celebrated every year to this day by our Jewish friends. They call it the Feast of Hanukkah. Sometimes we refer to it as the Feast of Lights, and it's their declaration of independence. The time when someone from the outside tried to force their worship of paganism, and they said, "We will not go. We will only worship God," and we applaud them. And Jesus actually seems to have celebrated the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Hanukkah, in John chapter 10. There's a reference to that in John chapter 10. Now, I said that Daniel chapter 7 in particular and Daniel chapter 8 are going to be in parallel. Daniel 7, that was a dream that comes in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. This vision is given to Daniel, not to Belshazzar, but in the third year, still within the lifetime of Belshazzar, the third year of his reign. In Daniel 7, we saw the successive beasts rise up out of the ocean that represented Babylon, Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and then that other kingdom. Is that the Seleucid kingdom? Is that Rome? I think when we compare it, we're going to see Seleucus. In Daniel's 8 vision, we don't see all four of those. Instead, we see a ram standing by a canal, and this ram is attacked by a goat coming from the west. And we don't have to guess. We're actually going to be told that these represent the Medes and the Persians, and then Greece. So notice it's the middle two. And you say, well, it doesn't really address the other kingdom. It will address the 10 horns, 10 toes. We'll see that number 10 again. And we'll see the little horn. In Daniel chapter 7, we see the terrible beast that has 10 horns. In Daniel chapter 8, the large horn is broken, the large horn representing Alexander the Great, and that gives way to 10 horns. In Daniel 7, out comes the small horn that pulls up the three previous horns, that utters great boasts, that makes alterations in times and law, and that wages war against saints, and for a time wins against them. All those things describe what Antiochus Epiphanes did against the Jewish people. Well, Daniel chapter 8, again, there's this image of a small horn. Out comes a small horn. We're used to seeing that by now. And it grows exceedingly. It magnifies itself against heaven. It removes the regular sacrifice. That's what happened when Antiochus went into the temple and he set up a pagan statue in the temple. The regular sacrifice stopped, and it stayed stopped for 3.5 years. After which time the Jews regained access to their temple. Their independence wasn't won at that early. That took quite a bit longer. But they did regain the temple, and they did cleanse the temple, and they rededicated it and cleansed it and came back to worship the Lord. But notice the removal of the regular sacrifice and throwing down the temple doesn't mean it's destroyed at that point, but it means that it's overturned as far as being a place of worship for God until it's regained and cleansed. And he also flings truth to the ground. In Daniel chapter 7, the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. In Daniel 8, his reign endures for 2,300 mornings and evenings. Now, to get a day, each day has a morning and an evening, so you divide that by 2, and then you figure out how many days, months, weeks, and it's just short of 3.5 years. So again, it fits. Both prophecies are talking about the same period of time. In Daniel chapter 7, at the end, we already said, then sovereignty, dominion, and greatness are given to the saints of the Most High. In Daniel chapter 8, then the holy place will be properly restored. And sure enough, that really took place. That took place in history. Chapter 8, verse 19, he said, behold, I'm going to let you know, this is God telling Daniel, what's going to happen, what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. These are end time prophecies, end time for Daniel, not necessarily end time for us, but for Daniel. The ram, which you saw with the 2 horns, represents the kings of Media and Persia, and we already said this was the kingdom of the Persians, stretched from the Greek Isles all the way to the borders of India. And then the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now you say, well, didn't Alexander come from Macedonia? Not technically Greek, but to an outsider, they were all Greeks. So yes, he represents this large horn who conquered the entire Persian Empire in the space of 10 years. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, that is the Alexander's nation, although not with his power. And so you had Cassander and Lysimachus, Lucas, and Ptolemy. These were the surviving generals. A bunch more fought initially, but these were the big winners, and they carved up the empire between themselves, rather unequally, I should say. In the latter period of their rule, you move forward a good more than 100 years. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, and here's why we called this the insolent king. A king will arise insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. Actually, it was his father who sort of set everything up. His father is actually known as Antiochus the Great, and then I think of Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. That's a name he gave to himself, as Antiochus maybe the not quite so great, and we'll see why, and we'll see, especially like I said, the bigger story when we get to Daniel chapter 11. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree. He's actually going to invade Egypt, and he's going to win in Egypt until Rome tells him, pack your bags and get out. And he'll prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men. And here's what's significant about our passage, and the holy people. He's going to come against the people of God. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. Now, you have to understand what took place is he had the high priest secretly murdered. He had an accident arranged for him, and actually had a renegade Jewish person put in his place, somebody who wasn't even from the tribe of Aaron, who was put in his place as the new high priest. That was part of the intrigue that's being described here. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He actually comes into Jerusalem, not breaking through the walls, but just marching in. They don't even know they're going to be at war with him. And he will even oppose the prince of princes. You say, well, who is that? Is that perhaps what was eventually going to be the royal line? Is this opposing God, King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Is this opposing God's anointed one? But he will be broken without human agency. Now, what's interesting to note is the death of Antiochus. After he had set up that pagan altar, he marched to war in the east. He had some rebellious colonies. And while he was there, he had left orders for an invasion of Judah. And another of his armies had gone down to invade Judah and had been defeated by the Jews. And he heard this. And he said, "That's it." He hopped in his chariot and he said, "We're heading back to Judah. I'm going to turn Judah into a city of tombstones. I'm going to kill every Jew there." And he was urging his charioteer, "Go faster, faster, faster." And we read that this is in 2 Maccabees chapter 9 and verse 7. He fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Notice he didn't fall in battle. Nobody struck him down. This was a divine accident. And he went from bad to worse, and in torment was eaten by worms. And the book of Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, describes his death in horrific, terrible detail of the agonies that he went through, recognized as being this was the hand of God against this pagan king. Our passage ends then, "The vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days." And notice in the future is added by the translators. That's in italics. It pertains to many days. In other words, he's telling Daniel, this isn't going to happen next week. There's going to be a number of events that take place to bring this about. And from the time that Daniel lived to the time when this took place was a couple of hundred years that go by before this is all fulfilled.